Okay, so first of all, thank you all for having me. As Carsten said, my name is Jay Jones and I'm from the University of Kaiserslautern-Landau in Germany. I actually work as a research associate for the chair of strategy, innovation and cooperation. And what this talk will be about today is the change of work and workforce due to robot introductions. So let's start off with the headline. Better than human, why robots will and must take our jobs. Sounds a bit scary, sounds a bit as if we don't really have a choice. But well, how bad is it really? Take a look at another headline. The project has avocados. But it kind of depends what jobs the robot is actually replacing. This doesn't sound scary anymore. But I think the first headline makes clear that either way, this is a topic of importance that we actually still need to think about. And it's ever present, as we can see in lots of headlines. I'm not actually going to go through these as such, but just take a couple of examples. So at the bottom, you can see robotic glove that lends a hand to relearn playing piano after a stroke. So positive in the healthcare kind of aspect. Yeah. But here on the left, robots do 39% of home tasks by 2033, say experts. So with cleaning, I mean, we all know Roombas, I think, to like go around Hoover so we can save time with that. Or in the middle, robot team on lunar exploration tours. So they can help with a lot of things that we just simply find more difficult to do without robots, so to say. Yeah. But coming back to a work context, because I want to stay in this kind of work context, where can robots actually be found? Well, for one, we've got them in manufacturing, so in the automotive industry, for example, these big like scalpel robots, big arms, or we've got them in marine use. So this actually being a marine robot, you might have seen this picture a bit ago. It was used to look for the submarine that went missing. This robot is called a Victor 6000. Another area is in logistics. This is Amazon Sparrow robot. So it handles like thousands of individual items, sorts them in various ways, so to say. Or we can even come over to healthcare. This is actually an interesting one I'm going to come back to again later. You can see in the background the Da Vinci robot. So on the left, you see surgeons emerge in their screen and they're actually handling this robot and doing minimally invasive surgery. So we can see that robots are ever present. We've got a lot of headlines showing robots and they're used in many fields. But are they actually positive or negative? Because we always hear a lot of talk about them. On the one side, we have lots of negative speak. So robots are taking our jobs, or robots can't handle unexpected situations due to them being programmed, so they've got kind of predetermined behavior. Or robots cost too much. I'm pretty sure a lot of you come into contact with this. I know Carsten has. They're expensive. So even if they may be helpful, can they even be afforded? And we've got robots as security risk. This is a problem in a lot of firms. How can they actually be accessed? Maybe this actually be dangerous at some stage. And coming over though to positive aspects, it's not all negative. Yeah, we've got robots' abilities compared to people. They're strong. They can do a lot that we can't. They can work constantly. They don't need breaks. Or they can function in dangerous environments. Also, coming back to this lab context, for example, I don't know, maybe it's toxic gases somewhere, places that are difficult for people to actually work in. Yeah? They can help there. And on the other side of costing too much, they may even be cost effective. So, for example, if we've got a manufacturing line, it may be cheaper to buy a robot that can actually pay wages or salaries for someone who only works. Difficult. But on the other side as well, we've got specializations and sites that are more precise than actually humanly possible. Okay, but still, with the background of this, we will and must be replaced by robots. Is this the case? Well, let's actually have a look at what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to start with a short conceptual background. So I'm going to show you where are we with robots, with the background of digital transformation, coming to what robots actually are, where we are in a timeline, and what types of robots there are. But just to give a kind of basic overview before coming to the managerial perspective on technology and robots, where I actually come from. So kind of going a bit away from this technical view, but looking at kind of social angle, then going into the research regarding robot introductions and job impacts. I'm going to show you 3 example studies where changes were looked at due to the implementation of robots. And then I'm going to end with a short sum up and the future outlook. So starting with the conceptual background, where are we? Well, we've got this background of digital transformation. Just to go through it once, what is digital transformation? Well, it's a fundamental change process enabled by the innovative use of digital technologies, accompanied by the strategic leverage of key resources and capabilities, aiming to radically improve an entity and redefine its value proposition for stakeholders. That's very long. Keeping it short, it just means we've got an implementation of some kind of technology, but we want a payoff in some form or fashion. Yeah? So this is obviously the start of many change operations when we've actually got something new coming into the workplace. Yeah. And like I said, we're actually focusing on the workplace. So we're looking at the digital technologies, or in our case here, robots that help with work in organizations. Over the years, this has become more and more. So these technologies that have been integrated into work. We started in the 80s, or well, I'm starting here with talking about the 80s, with small integrations at the workplace, followed by intertwined digital networks that are automated. Now we have AI aspects integrated into them. Okay, so we know where this we have this background of digital transformation, but where are we in the time? Well, we actually now in something called industry, I hope this would be the correct term as well, 4.0. Yeah. And we've got more than that, we've got a few industry revolutions that we can go through here. So the first one being industry 1.0, 1784 with steam power. Yeah. The second one being mass production that was enabled in 1870. We've got the example of Henry Ford in 1913 with the automated assembly lines. We've got industry 3.0, more automations, computers being more widespread, or industry 4.0 now with cyber physical systems, the Internet of Things and networks, and a key factor here actually being the robots, as mentioned. Yeah. So now we know where we are in kind of the timeline. But what are robots? Well, in short, I just go through this. Yeah. We can find robots obviously in robotics. Yeah. What is robotics? Well, you can follow me on this slide. It's a branch of engineering and natural sciences that includes mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, computer sciences, and others. And it deals with the design, construction, operation, use of robots and computer systems for the control, sensory feedback, and information process. Okay, and derived from this, a robot, therefore, is an entity that implements the above-named interactions with the physical world based on sensors, actuators, and information processing. There's a number of definitions I've taken. One of them actually pretty generic. I think what we actually just need to remember is that we have some kind of software integrated into hardware that has a materiality aspect to it, so it can actually interact with the physical world. That's what's sort of important here. So we know where we stand, we know what a robot is, what types are there. Well, I'll show you a few examples. I'm definitely not going into detail on this because there's just so many, just to give kind of an overview where they are. So we've got industrial robots, as mentioned earlier, like the SCARA robot, or we've got service robots, the domestic ones like the Roomba. We've also got agricultural robots, so autonomous tractors, for example, are coming over from autonomous tractors to autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, and even going up to military and defense robots. So we can see that the robots actually exist in a lot of fields. And as I'm speaking now, I'm pretty sure more robots are actually being created and constructed to help in various fields. Okay, just as a short overview, not to go too much into the robotics area, like I said, but just so you know where we can find these things. So where are we? We've got the background of digital transformation. We know what a robot is, we know that they're ever present, and we know that they're in a lot of fields. So what I want to go over to now is actually the managerial perspective on these technologies and robots. So what is my field looking at, and where do I actually come from? And to do that, I need to shortly explain what field of study I'm actually coming from. So that's in German called Betriebswirtschaftslehre. Yeah? The translation of this would in American be business administration. But as such, that doesn't quite capture everything, because this is where the American and the German system differs a bit. Betriebswirtschaftslehre is a very big and broad field. So it encompasses, as it says here, most management lenses, whether it's marketing, finance, logistics, human resource management, or where I'm from, strategy, innovation, cooperation. It's a very broad field and not split up into different areas such as management or management sciences. So you can get a full broad spectrum of these social sciences. And something that is a bit weird maybe at first glance, but we cooperate with different faculties in these actual things. So, for example, at the end of my hall, back in Kaiserslautern, we've got the law faculty, and we do a lot with them, instead of actually working with psychologists and sociologists, even us being social scientists. Just a kind of weird quirk, so to say, in that area. Yeah, but what is the difference now to looking at these robot implementations through our lens in comparison to the technical view? Well, as mentioned, we don't look at technical filters. These are in the foreground for us. What we want to know is what effect the technology has. So, for example, on the surroundings, the workplace, if you have a massive robot that comes into this area, how do things change? The culture, for example, hierarchies. Could it be that we get a flat hierarchy at some point, or do status groups go up and down for some reason? We get to that example in a bit. Or the work itself, do I have to do something differently? Do the actors have to do something differently. And we've got the job profiles. Do people need new skills to get along with the robots in this case? Or do they maybe need less skills than they used to? And another part of the culture is actually the interactions between the workers. For example, if you've got a technology that comes in and changes how people interact, maybe not by talking anymore, but via email, that is a change in how they actually go about with one another. So what hopefully becomes clear is that we actually look at the socio-material aspect. When something comes into the workplace, what changes on a social level and in their work area. And this is all down to processes. So all of these actions that we're actually looking at are well, a flow of actions. So we can see that changes actually come into play here, and we can watch these processes change. That's what we like to do. See on the kind of the micro level what really changes, where we can give this kind of example of we automatically come into change management. And just as a keyword, that means in organizational behavior, because a lot of people seem to know the term organizational behavior. Just to give you the example, that's what we do. We look what changes in organizations. Yeah. And to show you how we do this, well, we use various theoretical lenses to see how work can actually change. And I'm going to go into two examples here just shortly, one that I work with as well, one called routine dynamics and one being technologies practice. Routine dynamics here is a concept by Bergman and Pentland. What is a routine? Where it's a repetitive, recognizable pattern of interdependent actions involving multiple actors. Yeah. You'd think a routine is pretty stable, fixed, or standardized, like SOPs. As such, though, it isn't. As Feldman puts it, routines are actually full of life, so they're dynamic. They can change. Well, why can they change? Well, how does this actually work? On the left, we've got a very simple model, really, to make this clear. We've got the performing aspect of the individuals. So they perform a certain act, and by carrying on performing this act and repeating this act, it becomes a pattern, and that's how the routine works. Yeah? But as things are based within actions, actions can change. Giving you a simple example, let's say a firm is usually replying or reading and replying to emails in the morning. Yeah? Something might happen that we say, okay, we have to now set meetings in the morning, so we can't do this process anymore, and we start changing it to the afternoon. If that happens once, that's fine, that's not changing the routine. But something may happen that it becomes clear, okay, this is actually a better way of going about things. So maybe, for example, customer relations, we get like a feedback if we actually interact with them in the afternoon. Just kind of a pretty random example, but that could happen. And in that case, we may change our whole behavior to moving into the afternoon. That's just actually a timing difference. Yeah? There's actions that can change as well, but just as a basic example of how routine may actually change. Okay, that's the first example, how can things actually change from micro actions, so to say, and have a larger effect, larger going consequence. Going on to more of a technological example of looking at implementations and how things may change, we take technologies as practice. This was actually a theory coined by Olikowski in 2000 and is based on the structuration theory of 1984. I'll get to that in a minute. But what was done is that a technology was introduced into various firms, and it was observed how these firms then went about using the technology. And 3 ways of using the technology were actually found here. There may be more, but in this study there were 3. So the first one being, okay, the technology is used, but work doesn't really change. Not a big difference. Yeah, well, actually, no difference. Then we've got using a technology and it actually improves work. And then we've got a bit of a more far-reaching kind of area, and that is the technology is used and it changes completely how work is done. So these are the 3 fields here that were found. What is this based on, though? Why are technologies used differently? Well, it had to do with the different cultures of these firms, which I can kind of make clear here with this example on the left, which actually is derived, like I said, from Gilden's structuration theory, but this is actually the theory itself. So what we can see at the bottom is actually how actors, where the actors are and why they act in what ways and how they actually use the technology. And at the top, we've got the structure. So let's say we've got a department, which is a structure, or a firm, which is a structure, and we've got how the individuals actually work together with the technology. And they work with the technology depending on 3 things: the facilities, norms, and the interpretive schemes. The facilities being pretty much, what options have I got? How can I use the technology? The norms being, what is seen as being okay when using the technology? And the interpretive schemes being, how do I personally see the use of this technology as being good or bad, and how do my surroundings. So my co-worker or my boss sees the use of this technology. And depending on that, that is how the technology is then used. And because of that use, it becomes acceptable within the structure to use the technology in a certain way. So once again, we've got this kind of these micro actions that in some form influence the macro environment, so to say. And in that sense, we've got the macro environment that then has the effect on the micro environment. If we get someone new, a new hire into the firm, they will use the technology in the way that is used by the structure. Yeah. But at the same time, because once again, when you look at the action level, the micro level, things change. So people use things differently. It may be that in some way something is done in a different sense, in a different way, and that then is accepted more by the people as such, and then the structure changes again. And then once again, you can see this difference when someone new comes in, they use that behavior or learn that behavior. Okay, 2 examples to see just how changes can be well researched and here in a technological sense. And I'm now going to show you examples where these kind of robo introductions came into play and what changed there within jobs. I've got 3 examples I'm going to go through with you. The first one being a robo introduction into a pharmacy, the second one being a robo introduction in a hospital ward, and the third one being a robo introduction in surgery. Before I then get to the research methodology, of how things are actually done here, or in my field of it done here. And I actually only just realized yesterday that these are 3 healthcare examples that wasn't on purpose and doesn't actually make a difference. The first example being the robot introduction in the pharmacy. So to give you a kind of overview of what was done here, the examination of a pharmaceutical dispensing robot was done in 2 UK hospitals. The robot distributes to wards and it dispenses to patients. The affected parties are pharmacists, the technicians, and the assistants. And the theoretical lens here that was used, Pickering's tuning concept. Pickering's tuning concept, just to keep this short, is it sees changes or implementations as being an emergent process. So we have 2 sides. We have resistance and we have accommodation. Resistance just meaning that the technology isn't used in the way it's supposed to be used by the people. And accommodations meaning some things are changed so that it is used the way it's supposed to be used. And the research methods that I'm just going to name here quickly because we get to that at the end of this, is that they collected data via site visits, they made observations, held formal interviews, took part in formal discussions, and publicly available documents were searched for. So of all of these, the most important one though is the observation, so we can keep that in mind later on. Let's have a look how the workplace actually changed here though. I'm going to try and keep this one simple because it went actually quite into detail, but we don't really need to do that. On the left, you can see what the workspace used to look like before the robot was introduced. So we've got the outpatient counter at the front, we've got the medication or the pharmaceuticals, and we've got the workbenches at the front. Yeah. On the right-hand side, we've got the robot introduction. You can see it, that middle bullet there, on the right, is the robot itself. And that always needs to be loaded. So a lot of shelves were replaced and the robot was simply loaded with these pharmaceuticals. And there's a chute to the front, to the patient counter, that then, so to say, spat out these pharmaceuticals. What should be mentioned at this point, just so that in a minute it becomes a bit more clear, we've got a kind of barrier that was created here. So between the front end and the back end. The front end is where you can find the pharmacists and the technicians, and the back end is where you can find the assistants loading the robot and doing various work there. So, like I said, I'm going to try and keep this one simple. The first one I'm going to do, the next slide is going to show a few kind of small workflow changes, just to give an example of what can happen before I get to the bigger changes. But here we've got, as mentioned, some accommodations. Yeah. On the one side, it was pretty easy. We've got assistants, they had to start work earlier because they had to load the robot and they could only do this item by item and it was very slow. So obviously they needed more time. Yeah. We've got moving of some of the pharmaceuticals because they noticed pretty quickly that some of these pharmaceuticals had to be had to be got quickly, and they couldn't because the robot was also slow, not just in loading, but also in giving out the items. So they changed those to shelves to actually be able to get them quickly. We've got adjustments made in time. I think with everything, when something new is implemented, something else, somewhere else, something new is done, we find problems. We know we need to do something differently. As mentioned a minute ago, we've got the loading times and the dispensing times, which are a problem. So what was done with the robot was adjusted to actually allow for loading more items. I think if I remember correctly, there was another conveyor done, made, and they could pick more items out at once. Another thing is workplace adjustments. So yes, it's something small. Ladders started popping up at the workplace because what happened? The robot kept breaking down. So the technicians of the office every day climb up there, someone get out these little boxes that were stuck in there somewhere, or fix the robot. Just as a small kind of example of what can change in the setting. But we don't actually just have those kind of changes. We've also got boundary relations, so how people actually interact with one another. Yeah. So not only the setting is changed, but also relations. On the one hand, we've got technicians, their status kind of, I'll get back to that in a minute, the status, roles, because they started working together closely with pharmacists because they needed their help with the robot. On the other side, we've got the pharmacists started ignoring assistants back-end work because they started kind of getting in the way. We talked about these loading times a minute ago, and often the assistants had to do the bulk orders for the wards. So they had like loads and loads of items coming out. There's the machine was blocked for 10, 20 minutes at a time, and the pharmacists and the technicians couldn't get out their work. So they were starting to be seen as more of a nuisance than anything else, and they couldn't even be seen from the front anymore. So they felt downgraded either way. So small changes, now to the one that I actually want to mention, as with some of these examples anyway. We've got changes in skills, jurisdiction, status, and visibility just through this one robot implementation. Yeah? I handpicked some out here. The first one being skills, learning programming skills, or programming basics. That's meant that the pharmacist actually had to learn new skills in programming because he had to adapt and change the robot if, for example, dosages change, or they need bigger boxes or things like that, so that the robot actually knew what it was doing. Second example being the jurisdictions. First one, assistants could not influence the robot. So as mentioned a minute ago, they actually they weren't allowed to do anything. Their work was downgraded. They couldn't be seen anymore, and they were seen as a nuisance, and it just got worse and worse for these assistants. Well, on the other side, we've got the technicians and the pharmacists that just do workarounds. So you have to imagine you've got an assistant that isn't allowed to do anything. And then you've got pharmacists that just think, oh, I really want to get that pharmaceutical now, and they just press the emergency stop button, get out of the pharmaceutical, and take it to the front, and done. And they were allowed to do that, but in that time, the assistants got even more frustrated because they had to wait for the robot to start working again, which obviously they needed a technician for. So they all became a bit difficult in that area, and that's where we get over to the status. Obviously, the assistant work here was downgraded, and this barrier kind of devalued them. Yeah. And the technicians, I stick to those two examples for now, the technicians became more valuable because they were problem solvers. They could fix the robot, they could do different things, and they could help out. And I won't get to that point because the visibility doesn't materialize back again, the robot changed that you couldn't see the assistant. Yeah. But with all of these, what I actually want to make clear is that we've got materiality aspect, which is important. There's a social materiality aspect again. So we can see changes just by placing this robot here, especially with the assistants, in that they just were completely downgraded. This has far-reaching consequences to job satisfaction. People don't want to do the job anymore. So that can change future job profiles. First example. Now the second example, the robot introduction in the hospital ward. Again, short overview, we had the examination of the effects of the implementation of a mobile robot to do night rounds in hospitals. So this mobile robot could be maneuvered around by the doctor externally from outside of the hospital to the different patients. The affected parties obviously here were who were working in the hospital, the nurses, the doctor who was outside of the hospital in that moment, and the resident. And the study conceptualized, as it says here, the coordination as materially enacted. So jumping over to this last point, the goal was actually to analyze changes in the coordination processes of knowledge due to the material enactments. Yeah, well, sounds maybe a bit complicated, but we get to that in a minute. And once again, the research method I want to highlight here, we've got the observations and the interviews. It's the observations of importance. So I just talk you through the old way of how the night rounds were done, and then the new way. The old way, well, in both ways, the resident first had to get information about the patients, and then got into contact with the doctor and spoke to them about their status and further treatment options. Yeah. And the old way was by using a stationary phone. So they didn't even walk around or weren't able to check the patient. They were sat somewhere in the ward and talked to the doctor about all the patients. Now, there was two ways of going about this. We've got regulating and calibrating. Here, the residents gathered the patient information by actually visiting the patients or asking the nurses, who obviously spent the most time with the patients, so they know what is actually going on. And then depending on what they actually found out, what they talked about, calibrations were made to the treatment during or after the phone call by the doctor and resident. Yeah. And we've got another option of how this was done, and that is called skimming guiding. Here the residents gathered the information via a computer and added their experiences from during the day. The lazy option, so to say, because they didn't actually have up-to-date information. They didn't really know what was happening. And that led to, like I said, the doctor actually having to guide what to do next. They didn't know what really was happening, and the doctor had to ask more questions. Now, it was a new concept. Yeah, we've got this robot that was logged into by the doctor and could be maneuvered around to the rooms. Here, we've got the first option, regulating exploring. Here, once again, the residents gathered the information properly, so to say, went to the patient, looked what the status was, and talked to the nurses. Yeah, and when the night round then came around, the robot would go around where the doctor was involved and go to the different patients, and here the nurses got involved. So the nurses could give information about the actual status of the patient, who was obviously monitored by them constantly, and more parties got involved. So the nurse was involved, but also the patient was involved. So the patient could directly be asked, how are you feeling? Then we've got the other thing, is skin bypassing, once again, not done properly. And here, what ended up happening was that the resident couldn't really give any helpful information. So he was just ignored in this conversation, even though he's actually pretty much the one learning and that should be doing his job. Yeah. But instead, the information for the doctor was actually given by the nurse and the patient. Okay, so that's the change, so to say, what actually happened just via this robot introduction. What are these changes? Well, we can skip this because they're actually pretty self-explanatory and get to them straight away. The main thing is the nurses' input. So the nurses had a lot more to say here, and obviously this was important because they knew the most about the patient as they spent the most time with them, and because of that, also more patient adjustments were made, which were helpful, and this reduced the assessment discrepancy between these night rounds and the next day shift. Yeah. So they got better care constantly, so to say. And we've got one interesting point, which is this skimming problem duality. When this robot was introduced, for whatever reason, the resident was actually able, in simpler cases of patients, to present how the patient was doing more coherently than before. So they kind of lied their way through actually giving the status kind of, they could just pretend it was easy. But this changed as soon as it got a bit more complicated, and then that's when they were bypassed because they couldn't give actual information. Yeah. So that then led to the skimming problem reparability, so to say, in that the nurse could always intervene if the resident didn't actually know what was going on. But this in the long term at the same time led to the resident actually going in and getting more information because they couldn't go through work that way anymore. And we've got one negative kind of change that happens through this robot thing, which is a high coordination of the parties. I think this is pretty obvious. If you've got more people factoring into a discussion, it takes more time. There's more to discuss. So the night rounds just took longer. It was said to be something negative in this study. Personally, I wouldn't see it as being negative, but we can argue on that, I guess. But here in general, we can just see through this robot implementation, once again, we've got a group, especially the nurses, whose input was seen as being a lot more important. We could get past this problem of the residents not actually doing their job anymore. And the main important difference was here that there was a reduced difference in patient assessments, so to say. So they were taking better care of. That was the second example. Like I said, I'm trying to keep this all very simple, not going too much into detail. I hope I haven't done that too much. Well, yeah, third example now, the robot introduction in surgery. Getting back to the Da Vinci robot that we saw earlier. So here, we've got the examination of how coordinated surgery actually changed. Obviously, before this robot was there, the surgeon was there to say, okay, do this, give me that, help me with that, hold this, different forms of doing that. But here, there was an augmentation of the surgeon and the reduction of his physical movement, sight, and hearing because he was indulged in this screen here. He couldn't see or hear properly anymore, and he couldn't coordinate anything. Yeah? And that obviously had an effect on the joint task performance between who was actually in the surgery. So that's the surgeon, the resident, the nurse, and the anesthesiologist. And this led to changes obviously in the space because we've got this massive robot, how work is actually done, task distribution, and various factors. And just to once again show how this paper looked at the theory, where they put importance on an embodiment perspective. Yeah, so technologies are now overcoming physiological limitations and what changes does this bring? And I like this example because it's pretty easy. we've got 4 practitioners, the residents, nurses, anesthesiologists, and surgeons, and they simply had a role transformation due to this robot implementation, and there were certain needed changes. So going through person by person, we've got the residents. They had a decrease in direct involvement in surgical performance. Obviously, they're not stood at the table anymore and don't need to help. And the only thing they can do is look at the screen or the surgeons actually do. So their training changed, their job changed so that they needed to be skilled in robotic surgery. Then we've got the nurses. Here we had an increase in autonomy and responsibility. The simple reason that they were still at the surgical table, and they took more the role of the coordinator, what was actually happening, and had to intervene more often. So they also then expanded on their training in that they had to learn some surgical skills if they had to intervene. Then we've got the anesthesiologists, which I actually find quite amusing, and that is that they've got an increase in involvement in patient safety, and they had to formalize safety changes. So what does this mean? Well, you've got this massive robot in front of the patient, and they just simply couldn't get at the patient to do anything. So they actually had to find workarounds and kind of document how the patient then needed to be put down so that they could get to them. For example, in certain surgeries, they had to turn the patient completely around, do the surgery from the other side to get at the patient, things like that. So they're actually kind of way of working changed. And then we've got the surgeons. Obviously, they've got an increase in focus on robotic surgery skill, and a decrease in this team supervision. So they pretty much just got more skilled in using a robot, but they had reduced team supervision because that's what now the nurses are doing. Okay, those were the 3 examples. Like I said, kept it pretty easy, kept it pretty simple, hopefully, anyway, just to show small examples of how work can change through these robot implementations. I want to show now how actually this work is done within these 3 studies, because this was also done by observations, and how work is done in my field, so to say. So we don't do much quantitative research. We do qualitative research. We go in and we have a look at what is going on. We've got 2 ways of doing this. We can hold interviews, or we can make observations. I could go into detail. If you've got questions here, you can ask me later, but what I actually want to get at here is the observation, because I could say, okay, interviews, we've got unstructured, semi-structured, structured. It's just different types of questions, so to say. But the observations, especially participating observations, are those that are of importance, because we put a massive value on ethnography. Ethnography being participating observations, so becoming like a part of the team and the culture and getting involved in what is actually going on. And ethnography, not just being a simple form of participating observations, but actually, well, it kind of is, but you have a benchmark of a minimum amount. So at least 12 months is what you say you do in observing, to call it ethnography. But what is actually the added value of doing it in this way, observing people for a long amount of time? Well, we've got quite a few. The first one being that we can check biased interview answers. People often don't really put importance on certain parts of their work which are actually of importance, but you can only see that from an outside perspective, so we can check that. Or people may act differently for only a certain amount of time. So if someone's watching me constantly, I'm going to be doing my work differently, probably better. Yeah. But either way, that changes at some point, especially if someone becomes a part of the team. Yeah, they kind of, so to say, drop the act, and we can see how things really are. Thirdly, we've got granular observations. So things that may not actually seem important can be seen from the outside as being important, even if it's just pressing a button every day. It's some kind of far-reaching consequence. That's things that you can only see from the outside. And changes can be observed over a large period of time, as there is an adjustment time involved, which makes change a process. I was talking about this earlier. We've got this flow of actions, yeah, and we can see changes in how technology or robot, for example, is used after a month in comparison to after a year. Just to give an easy example, if a firm implements Outlook, for example, yeah, and people don't really want to use it. Often people don't want to use new technologies; they just don't like it. Yeah, but they have to, because that's how they get their emails. If they don't check their emails, they're probably not going to do their job. So they look into Outlook and use the emails. What can happen after 2 or 3 months is that someone goes and says, oh, this has got a calendar. This is great. And then they can start making appointments, just using more aspects of the same Outlook. And this can happen over time if someone sees it's beneficial. Just a very, very easy example. But that's more aspect that can be used of the technology, but can also change how technology is actually used. Often technology is used in ways that they're not actually supposed to be used. Anyway, just as an example there to show you that after a long amount of time, longer amount of time, you can see changes within work of using technologies. And here, one more, we've got observations over a large period of time may uncover unknown connections. I quite like this one because, for example, I've given the example here of communication channels. Let's take coffee breaks. I think pretty much everyone knows when you have a coffee break with your colleagues, you're going to talk about work in some way. And this may actually be a large part of knowledge management. Some firms aren't very good in documenting what they're actually doing. Some firms might not have any type of knowledge management, and people learn from what they hear from other people, if this is the case. So by following these kind of conversations, we can see, okay, is this how people actually learn in the firm? Is this how they actually work, or can they look things up? And in that case, well, just to give an example here of something I'm working on, that's a problem in some areas, and you need to have some kind of knowledge management system, because if someone leaves the firm that has worked on something and no one else knows how to do it, you're not going to get that information anymore. It's lost. So there's some aspects that can be found in that area. So what am I actually getting at here? Why is this so important? Well, this is obviously a good thing that we can get a complete picture showing an unrealistic scenario. That's why we like to do these observations over a large amount of time. Okay, so that's the importance of ethnography, which was also used in all of these studies. Well, one of them not, but still a large, longer time of observing, so to say. And at the end, I just come up with a short sum up and future outlook. So, just to give you some key takeaways of this presentation. Firstly, robots are coming, and in the least, they are causing job displacements. Yeah. Secondly, it's important to actually understand the changes to work and people that robot implementations are having and will have to see how work and jobs change. Thirdly, for this, it's important not only to look at the technology, but to observe the interactions with it. And how do we do that? Well, with ethnography, because we can see how things really are in comparison to how people think they are. And just to get back to this first point, robots are coming. I'll put you an example here. In the year 2000, we had 100,000 robot introductions. Yeah. In industry alone, this is only industry. And in the year 2016, we had 300,000, 3 times that, and that number is still rising. And this is only industry. So we can see they are coming and changes will happen. But as a closing statement, we don't know in that sense how, well, what kind of impact, so to say, is going to have. We don't know if there is going to be a negative impact on employment. But what we do know is that it's clear that our future salaries actually depend on how well we work together with robots. It's changed over the years with technology, and now it's becoming where we're getting there with robots. That's it from me. Thank you for your interest. I'm open for any questions, and if you have any questions afterwards, feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.